Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Jeremy Dauber. Jeremy is a professor of Jewish literature and American studies at Columbia University. He's the author of 6 books, and today we will speak about his latest book, American Comics, a History. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm super excited to talk about something that I know very little about, which is comics. I mean, I think most of my friends, they know comics from the movies. They know about Batman, Superman, the X-Men, Spider-Man. How can you avoid it with the millions of dollars of advertisement that these movie companies put in? But many of us don't know much about the background. Where do they come from? Who creates them? How long have they been around? So, I mean, you are going to help us find that out. But before, can you tell us a little bit about your own superhero story? Where do you come from? I see that most of your work is about the Jewish literature and Jewish stories, and then somehow you put your cape on, and now you're writing about superheroes.
Well, I think, you're absolutely right to say that right now comics, and particularly, although not only, but particularly superhero comics, is this kind of omnipresent phenomenon in international culture, really. This was something where I really wrote this book to say, people who care about what's going on in the world, people who care about cultural currents, kind of say, hey, this is a thing. I want to learn more about the background of this thing. And so I tried to write a book that would explain at least the whole American side of the phenomenon, which has been, as you said before, it's really so influential. And so for me, it's true that a lot, although not all of my academic work has been about Jewish literature and Jewish related matters, but I was a comics fan from long before I started doing any of that. I really, as a kid, I grew up with Sunday newspapers that had a lot of different comic strips in them. And then from a very early period, I started, like certainly a lot of American kids, but I think a lot of kids around the world, becoming attracted to sort of your standard superhero comics, your capes and tights comics with Batman and Superman and Spider-Man and all those kind of guys. And then as I got older, I found out that, and some of that stuff felt a little juvenile for me, especially at the age that I am. There was a new wave of comics, both about superheroes and not, that was really much more mature. And they were dealing with much more mature kind of issues, whether that be personal autobiographical stories, whether that be history. And so I gravitated to those too. But I was always interested in all these different parts of it. And so eventually I became a professor at Columbia and said, you know what? Particularly, although by no means only in America, this is a major cultural phenomenon and it has a history and it also is a major art form. And I could start teaching a class about it. And that's what I did for about 10 years. And I said, you know what? There's a book in this to as you were saying before, kind of explain to everybody this whole big story. And that's what I tried to do. And that's what's out in bookstores and online right now.
Well, as I remember through my childhood, I was always discouraged to read comic books because I don't know, they were for you wouldn't learn anything useful from comic books, according to my parents. And only now, when there are professors like yourself saying, no, this is a cultural issue that we should re-examine because they have shaped our society. You start your book with Thomas Nass and how his comics even change or influence the politics of his time, and make people aware that even though they couldn't read English properly, they got their message by the comics. So I wonder if we could start by there at that time of Thomas Nash, how comics were starting to shape our culture and our politics.
I think it's a great question, and I think that it's really important because it really helps to think about two different stories that I'm telling in the book and that we think about. One is the story of the way, again, in America, in Franco-Belgian cultures and Japanese cultures, is a little different, but in American culture, comics have also grown up. These comics, for a while in America, many of them were for kids, and they were kind of more juvenile. And over the last 30 or 40 years, the medium has really kind of expanded and matured so that there's still a lot of that stuff, but there's also a lot of stuff that really is aimed and designed at adults and is very serious aesthetic exploration. So that's one story. And the second story is as a cultural historian, or as people who are interested in reading about history, we can see how things which might have been aimed at kids or might have been little kids are still very culturally influential and powerful and really shape a kind of American culture and imagination. So I tell that story too in the book. But as you say, a lot of the American story of comics, and one way in which it shaped culture, starts with this guy named Thomas Nast, who was a cartoonist around the time of the American Civil War, so the mid 19th century. And one of the things that he did was draw cartoons which helped the United, I know this is an international audience, so this helped the United States, the Union in the Civil War, gather together morale and say, we really need to keep fighting the Civil War against those slaveholding forces of the Confederacy. And they did that. We all say that expression, a picture is worth 1,000 words. These very powerful images and cartoons that he did. And in the process, he also kind of invented or reinvented a lot of the images that are, again, omnipresent, certainly in American culture today. He made the image of Santa Claus that now a lot of us think of today. He made the image of many of you, if you follow political cartoons that are come out of America, you're familiar with the Republican elephant, the elephant that stands for the Republican Party, and the donkey that stands for the Democratic Party. He kind of made those in the forms that we think about now. So all of these kinds of things, really showed the power of what a cartoonist could do to kind of shape the currents of American culture. And when in the next part of the story, Nast wrote for these kind of weekly news magazines. They were a little more expensive. They were a little higher. You had to be kind of better off to kind of afford those kind of things. But people said, hey, these comics are really popular. We're going to start putting them into much cheaper and much more widely disseminated newspapers. Right? A weekly at that point, again, this is the 19th century, a weekly, the equivalent of something like Newsweek or Time or something like that, could be 10 cents. A newspaper could be a penny, right? And you would put those in the newspapers, and that really started American comics in a whole new mass direction. That was the next phase of the story, and that's where the birth of these comic strips that really still are around in newspapers today, to the extent that we still read paper newspapers today.
Right. Okay. So, yes, this podcast is an international audience,
Yeah.
but it seems to me that American cartoons are predominant all over the world. So, my question is it because they had outstanding, better talent, or outstanding, better marketing, or because of the influence of Hollywood, which also have tentacles all over the world?
I think you're identifying three very good theories. To me, I think if you look around the world and you see kind of the comics talent that in his other countries, I wouldn't necessarily make an argument about the strength of talent. I think there's a lot of talent in a lot of different places. I think that the marketing and the corporate savvy and reach of American culture, particularly in the 1920s and the 1930s and the 1940s, was very, very strong. So you have these syndicates that would sort of package these blocks of comic strips, and they would sell them all around the United States of America, but also all around the world. And those were very, very well put together, and they sold these comic strips all over the place. So that really got American comic strips, and then later I think American comic books, but about comic strips, a real foothold in. So that's why, first comic strips that came out of, for example, William Randolph Hearst's, that great News Giants papers, the King features, they were all over the world. Walt Disney's products, obviously his movies, but also his comics were all over the world. And Mickey Mouse became a hugely recognizable symbol. This was already before anyone had ever heard of a character named Superman, right? This was already coming in, Mickey Mouse, Popeye, all these kinds of characters. And then, of course, the superhero begins, and that has a world-shaping development as well.
You just mentioned Superman. Superman has been around for a long time, and I think it's part of the DC Comics family of comics books, which at one time in history was the predominant comic books, let's say, creator, until Stan Lee came with Marvel Studios and started uh, giving real competition. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the competition between these two comic books creators.
Absolutely. So this it's a great way to kind of put this out. So the great, let's call it the great age of superheroes, starts in the late 1930s, really 1938 with Superman coming around. And at that point, the company that would become DC Comics really had a predominant advantage. Um, Characters like Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, the Flash, the Atom, all these kind of characters in one iteration or another really were created sort of in that, a lot of them in that first wave. There was a company that would become Marvel Comics. It wasn't called Marvel then, but would become Marvel Comics around right at that period. They had some superheroes, the most famous of them being Captain America. He was around right around then. But most of them, as you say, don't really come about until about a generation later, a little over a generation later, in the early 1960s, when Stan Lee, who had been an employee of Marvel Comics since that earlier period, but really hadn't done very much, with a guy named Jack Kirby and a couple of other people, but really it's Jack Kirby and this guy Stan Lee, come together and create the series of heroes that we now think about as the basis of the Marvel Universe. Spider-Man, the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, the Hulk, all of these, Iron Man, all these kind of characters. And that really put superheroes back on the map in a very significant way. And in a lot of ways, although there have been other kinds of strands of the comic book world that have come up as well, most notably these kind of graphic novels, let's just call them for now. Superheroes have been in a pole position, they've been in the lead, they kind of haven't gone away. Whereas if you looked just in the 1950s, you might not have, before this, you might not have said that that was what was going to happen. There were all sorts of other comics, Western comic books, science fiction comic books, crime comic books, romance comic books. Any of those could have been the leading kind of thing. But after the 1960s, really they kind of, superheroes become this. And a lot of it, as you say, Elaine, has to do with, especially now, the way that movies have really just dominant. Movies and TV have told these stories to billions and billions of people.
Right. So at what time does Hollywood jumps into the action, and is Hollywood film the most efficient way that these characters have been monetized?
Yeah, great question. So ever since the very beginning of American comics, and this is a story I tell again in the book, Hollywood has been interested in taking comics and turning them into movies. That was true of these comic strips. There are movies based on the comic strips. There are serials in the early days of the talkies that are based on Superman and Captain America and Batman. And they have kind of middling success, I would say, for many decades, right? They can't really figure out how to do it. There are some successes, but not in a big way. And I think that, part of that is that for a long time, these comics were, as you were saying before, were dismissed as really for kids. You can't make kind of a big movie. You can only make a sort of not particularly serious kids movie. And part of it, I think, was that the special effects weren't very good. And so a movie that really was going to kind of make Superman or make Iron Man do, it really, it would have cost a tremendous amount of money, and it really wouldn't have looked that great. Nowadays, of course, that has changed. The explosion of digital effects and the incredible cheapening of those digital effects mean that you can make pretty impressive looking things on a TV budget, and certainly with a major feature film. And so so that's one side of it. And then the second side is that you have, particularly in Marvel Studios, I think under this guy Kevin Feige, you have a real commitment to kind of capturing what really made the Marvel Universe so special, which was this interlocking material that all these kind of characters were all together. And so, as a business moment, let's say, I don't think anything like what Feige has done is really even ever been in the history of American movies, to have 26, 27 movies and these TV shows and this all coming together in one big property. It's just an extraordinary achievement in business and in creativity. And it's unmatched, I think. So that's also been able to do it, right? You say, oh, I like this Iron Man movie. You go to your Disney Plus streaming service, you can watch that. You can watch 23 other movies and 15 other television shows. It's astonishing what's the case. And that's never been the case before.
Well, as you claim, these comics are a representation of American culture, and as I see the superheroes, they are all white, male, straight, and if there are female characters, which there are not that many, they are sexualized, they are sexy, scantily dressed. At what time does the comic book industry starts to be more open and inclusive and add, I don't know, black characters or maybe women who are not halfway dressed or undressed?
Yeah, this is a story also that I try and tell in the book, which is that a lot of the story of comics, which as you say are representations of American culture, are also also are just as important for what they don't show and how they show as opposed to what they do. And very frequently, they, like a lot of other kinds of American cultural media, say, you know what, we are going to take the what we perceive to be the easiest, least objectionable, most sort of shortcut to everybody coming in, which was a default of white men very frequently, and that was a big problem. It meant a lot of people weren't represented. It meant a lot of stories weren't represented. It meant that a lot of times people who were represented, who weren't those white men, were presented in ways that were sexist or misogynist or were racist. And part of the story of really of the last, let's call it 30 years, and really most prominently in the last 15 or 20, is the story, first and hugely importantly, of a more diverse group of people becoming involved in writing and producing these comics and these movies, right? And so you say, okay, well, this group of people, they're going to tell these stories. Also, a group, a much wider, I think, thanks to the internet, a much more answerable and less insular culture for these comics. And again, this was not always by intent. In other words, it wasn't that a lot of people necessarily said, we're going to make sure that nobody other than our small group writes comics. But when you didn't know anybody else, because the whole comics business was limited to a city or two, it was a lot harder than now. You can see people writing in the internet from literally all over the world. You can see people drawing, and you can say, not only can I see you, you're living in, South America, but I see your comics on the internet. They're amazing, right? But I can also email you an assignment. You can turn the assignment in and you can get it to me instantaneously. You can press a button and you can email it to me, or you can, transfer it to me in a way. Whereas in the 1970s, if you had to, work with someone on a monthly comic book and you were living in South America, the comic would take 4 or 5 days. The art, the actual drawn art, would take 4 or 5 days to get there. And for a monthly schedule, that just made it impossible. So you just simply didn't have, even for structural reasons, besides any other reasons, you didn't have these possibilities. And that enabled, I think I could say, a kind of really unfortunate and sometimes even shameful blinders in order to make, that these comics sort of all looked very, very much the same. And I think really that is much less the case now than it was even 15 years ago. And I think that is only going to strengthen. America's demographics are much different than they were 40 or 50 years ago. The ways in which people can look at talent and see them, and also the mindset that allows people to recognize that talent is important and good and worthy, not worthy, and should be in the comics is changing, and that's going to have very important, it already is having very important effects for the entire culture.
Why? I wonder if you could name offhand any comics that have some diversity or inclusion,
Yeah.
anyone where the hero is not a white straight man.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the best examples of this, and this very frequently happens, certainly in these big DC and Marvel things, through taking or transforming a kind of already existing name or property of a superhero. So about 6 or 7, maybe 7 years ago, A woman named G. Willow Wilson, a writer, said, I want to, she was given the property, she wanted to redo the property of a character named Ms. Marvel. And this character, in all sorts of iterations, had been around for many decades, right? But originally started basically as a lot of these Marvel named things because Marvel wanted to make sure that their trademark to the character kind of remained. So it was not a very interesting character. And this Wilson said, I'm Muslim. I want to create a character, a woman of color, who is a Muslim, and for whom this is not a kind of fetishized, fascinating, other kind of thing, but it's just part of her life. She's an American. She's a character. She's Muslim. She's a teenage girl. She's a teenage Muslim, and now she gets superpowers. And how is this going to play out in her family, right? And it's a lovely comic, because it really you can see just how not only that setting, but sort of the lived understanding of a real character grounded in that setting can make these stories, even if they are, mists from outer space change the person and they have a superpower and they're trying to fight crime, right? All these things. It can make them into a different kind of story. And I think that's phenomenal. So, and it's my understanding that there is now going to be, filmed versions. I can't remember, to be honest, whether it's going to be a television show or a movie. I'm really looking forward to seeing what they do with it. But Wilson and her creative team have done a wonderful job, with this character. So that's just one example. Yeah.
There is a new trend, which is the graphic novels, and the readership is becoming better educated, more intellectual. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about this trend. I mean, the New York Times now has a category of graphic novels bestseller list.
So one of the most complicated questions in writing about comics is to try and figure out what this phrase graphic novel means, because it can mean a whole lot of different things. People sometimes say, I'm going to take a couple of comic books, I'm going to put them together under hardcovers, I'm going to call it a graphic novel. Other people say, no, it really has to be this kind of ambitious work that really sort of deals with themes in a kind of artistically elevated manner. Other people say, not necessarily, but it has to be an original work that's like a couple of 100 pages long, right? So you have all these different definitions, and all of them can sometimes coexist kind of in these lists. But I do think that you're 100% right to say that over the last, let's say, 30 years, you really have this blossoming of this kind of material at a greater length. Sort of it's designed to be at a greater length, not just like the old comic books that were, only 20 to 50 pages long or whatever. They are often, they're sort of works that are trying to reach some kind of artistic height. And that, by the way, that doesn't mean that they can't be for kids, right? They can be really aimed at a child audience, right? But they can still be sort of a serious kind of work. And they're also, and I think this is important from the business perspective that we're talking about, they can therefore appear in public libraries, they can appear at bookstores, they can appear in schools, depending on the level in which they're written. So that's a huge change. When you and I, were growing up, obviously we're growing up in different countries, but certainly if you went even, in America, this place where I'm writing the book about, to a library, public library, and you said, can I read some comics, please? They just wouldn't be available. You wouldn't have them. And now, they have their own sections. They have sections for kids. They have sections for adults. They're in the bookstores. It's just a whole change. And I think that's not going away. I think that's where we are now. And of course, I'm a big fan of that.
Yeah, me too. I check out the book Sapiens by Noel Harari, which is a scientific piece of work, but it's nice to see it in graphics. I enjoy that experience very much. Let me ask you, your book focused mostly on US comics, but if you had to say who is a runner-up, sure the US and their comics has a great lead over everybody else, but I hear of Japanese comics, of Korean comics. Who would you say is in second place as far as popularity and yeah?
No. I will say that, I focus on this because that's the area that I know. And so anything once we get out of United States borders, I'm a little hazier on. But that said, it seems to me that in terms, at the very least, of popularity within a country, within its own country, diversity of material, aesthetic accomplishment. I don't even know whether I put the United States. I mean, in terms of Japan, Japan is a country where manga is really so incredibly part of the cultural matrix in so many deep and fundamental ways. I say this as someone who's an outsider, not only to the material. I don't read Japanese, but also to that body of work. I've read some, but it's not. I don't claim to be an expert on it. But I would think that would be sort of a very big one. The kind of Franco-Belgian area of bande dessinée is also a big area. But again, these are not my areas of expertise. But those would be the big three, as I would think, which would be the United States, Japan, and to a lesser extent, sort of the rest of Asia, and the Franco-Belgian area. But as you're pointing out, all sorts of countries have their own comics cultures. There's just wonderful stuff in all of them. And as a fan, I really hope that more, as it's beginning to happen, more and more of that stuff gets translated into English so that a wider variety of only English language speakers can really come to appreciate some of that stuff too. It's an audience that, you see with Netflix, you see with other things. This is an audience, the American audience is becoming much more willing to embrace material that was originally not created in English than it has been for quite a long time. And I think that it's really easy to have that come to comics as well.
Well, Jeremy, the one thing that I can get from your book is that comics is a serious business and it's a serious piece of art. So I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow your work.
Sure. So the title of the book is American Comics: A History, and it's available online. It's available wherever English language books are sold. You can get you can buy it online at my website, which is Jeremy Dauber, DAUBER.com, or you can follow me on Twitter, and I'm Jeremy Dauber, the same. That's my Twitter handle. So thank you. This has been a wonderful opportunity. Thank you
All
so
those
much.
links will be in the show notes. Jeremy, thank you so much for being here with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.